Dear friends, good evening and welcome to this webinar on dealing with grief and loss in COVID-19 times. Let us begin this webinar with a short prayer. And during this prayer, let us bring to our mind persons who are known to us and who have suffered and gone through pain and agony due to COVID-19. Let us bring those persons into our presence before our eyes and pray to Almighty God that during these moments of struggle, we may experience the strength of God and may receive the grace to overcome the grief, trauma, death, and suffering in such a manner that we become better human persons and a more loving society. My name is Father Francis Puducherry, and I am a Jesuit who is based in Pune. My present responsibilities include that of being the rector of Nobili College and professor at Deepa Institute of Philosophy and Religion. So a warm welcome to all the participants. Today we come together for a webinar that touches the lives of all of us. All of us have experienced some loss, some grief during COVID-19. Things have moved so fast, especially during the last few months, that it has hardly given time to process the grief and loss which has been suffered. The present webinar proposes to understand the unique nature of grief and trauma during these moments, and also to explore possible ways of dealing with it. So these are the two dimensions of this webinar. On the panel, we have two experts who are well qualified to respond to our concerns. We have Father Conrad Norona, who is a member of the faculty here at JD, Deepa. He's a Jesuit and the director of the Pastoral Management Center. Besides being a doctor by profession, he holds a PhD in counseling and supervision from the United States. A special area of his expertise is trauma-focused cognitive behavioral therapy. The second expert on this panel is Father Dinesh Braganza, who also is a member of the faculty at Deepa. He heads the Social Sciences Department. He holds a MA in Formative Psychology and a PhD in Psychology and Counseling from Loyola University, Maryland, USA. He was also a teaching assistant for research methods, statistics, and psychological testing at Maryland. The format of this webinar consists in 4 parts. We shall have 2 brief inputs by the experts on the panel. Father Dinesh will offer a general overview of grief and trauma. I repeat, a general overview of grief and trauma. He will further elaborate these points in the context of COVID-19 by speaking about causes, manifestations, and consequences of grief and trauma. Father Conrad will explore possible responses to the situation. His presentation will deal with possible means of closures, moving on, etc. He will indicate how this experience of grief and trauma, aptly handled, can help us grow towards being better human persons and communities. The third part will be a dialogue with the 2 experts on some important foundational questions of life. These include the long-term impact of COVID, the reality of fear, impact on communities, denial, guilt, the role of faith, and so on in dealing with the current situation. And the last part of the webinar will take questions from the audience. If you have any specific questions, kindly write in the chat box and we shall take them up according to the time available. It goes without saying, kindly keep your microphones on mute. In case you have any communication, please communicate through the chat box. The Zoom is full. So if any of your acquaintances still wants to participate in this webinar, there is a YouTube link through which they can participate in this webinar. Let us now listen to Father Dinesh as he offers us a general overview of grief and trauma during these times of COVID-19. Over to you, Father Dinesh.
Thanks, Father Francis. I'm going to start sharing a PowerPoint, and then I will work from there. Okay, so we're going to do a little brief overview of how do we cope with grief and loss, trying to understand what grief is, what loss is, how trauma comes into it. I thought of situating this presentation with these quotes, one from Viktor Frankl and some perspectives from Pierre de Chardin. Frankl says, when we are no longer able to change a situation, we are challenged to change ourselves. Pierre de Chardin, another great thinker, says, in the shadow of death, may we not look back to the past, but seek in utter darkness the dawn of God. We are one, after all, you and I. Together we suffer, together exist, and forever will recreate one another. And an invitation to all of us. The future belongs to those who give the next generation reason to hope. In these pandemic times, I think these are words that can speak to us. COVID has hit us hard. Every aspect of life has been affected. Students, teachers, parents, everybody. Not just individuals, not just families, institutions, educational, religious, industry, judiciary, very especially the whole medical system has been hit really badly. Poor management, delayed responses have aggravated the problem, and so that today, no one remains unaffected. Now, it has not just hit us at external levels, but it has hit us very deeply at the level of our identity, who we are as individuals, as families, as a society, as institutions, as religious identity, as a country. Our meaning systems have been battered. Meaning is kind of what shapes our lives. Meanings are the framework of life. Now, all of us are familiar with Jean Piaget, the Swiss child psychologist, who talks a lot about how we make meaning. He says there are these two basic processes, assimilation and accommodation. Assimilation is we have this general framework of life, and new information, new things that come in, we kind of fit it into this framework. But then along comes stuff that just does not fit into our current framework. And so we have to change this whole meaning system. And that is done through a process of accommodation. How do we do this? In assimilation, as we're trying to fit things, new information, new experiences into our existing framework, we will take experiences, we will generalize them. Things that don't really fit in, we will delete. Some things we will distort a bit so that they fit into our existing framework. But like I said, not everything fits in. And so ultimately we have to change our meaning system. Meaning systems are really important because they give us a sense of direction in life. They tell us what we can do, what we can't do. It gives us a sense of agency, efficacy. We know who we are through our meaning systems, and we have a sense of security and belongingness. Now, the pandemic has hit all of this. We have our sense of purpose, and suddenly now we don't know who we are. We feel helpless. We are suddenly feeling like we are the worst people because we're unable to take care of those we love the most. And our whole experience and expression of caring is now changed. So this is the global meaning-making model developed by Crystal Park. We have this overall meaning. And in this meaning, we have the sense of how the world runs. And then, of course, we have things like what are happening now. COVID comes along the line. All of these other things suddenly shake up this whole stuff. And when this happens, all the hidden fractures in our society, in our country, in our world come to the surface. So this pandemic has really highlighted all the changes that happened. It has brought to the surface all these losses, stuff that we used to take for granted, now we have to really think about. And underlying this all is this sense of grief. Grief and trauma, because much of the loss has been very traumatic, has been very sudden. So there is, in this global pandemic, there is a palpable sense of, it's not just me, it's not just I alone. All of us are grieving. And there is this great author, specialist on dealing with grief. He wrote actually a book with Elizabeth Kubler-Ross. Grief is actually multiple feelings, and I've added that, and meanings that we must manage. So here are a whole bunch of feelings that we have to deal with. There's anger, fear, anxiety, helplessness, shame, sadness. Sometimes you just don't feel anything. And there is this big area of guilt. Why do I survive when somebody else dies? Just yesterday, I heard of a family in Ahmedabad. A month ago, the parents died, then this husband and wife, one after another died. Finally, only the boy is left alone. Sometimes we have this guilt from not doing enough. And sometimes we have this guilt from, I may have caused harm to another, either by what I did or by what I did not do. All of this adds to this grief. It's expressed often through anger and anxiety, but we need to recognize that this is grief, this is loss. There are many phases of loss, so every change involves a loss and involves grief. There are many phases of this loss, many levels of this grief. So there's this loss of normalcy, loss of trust in reliable sources of information, loss of faith in our leaders, political, religious, everywhere. Economic losses, death of loved ones. And there is also this anxiety about the future, anticipatory grief. In this whole thing of God, where is God? What is God up to? So what other losses come to mind? When we have these losses, we kind of feel alone, abandoned, forced to fend for ourselves. Normally, when we have losses, we kind of come together to support each other. But in this pandemic time, what has happened is we cannot even come together, because that itself becomes a way by which we communicate death to one another. Anticipatory grief is a huge thing. The world that we lived in, the world that was safe, which was kind of organized, is suddenly now become an unsafe place. We have lost our sense of safety. So individually and collectively, we wonder, when is it going to be my turn? What's going to be next? And in the face of all of this, there is this question, how do we cope? How are we coping? How are we going to cope? In all of this, if we look at the pandemic, our primary response has been denial. If we look at Elizabeth Kubler-Ross's stages of death and denial, of death and dying, which Conrad will look at in greater detail later, the first stage is denial. Denial, is it a friend? Is it a foe? Is it helpful? Is it not helpful? Irvin Yalom, the existential psychotherapist, has a beautiful book called Staring at the Sun. And in that, he says, being aware of death is like trying to stare the sun in the face. you can only stand so much of it. Therefore, we need denial. Yes, denial is helpful, but as we know, too much denial can be really a bad thing. And it has made the problems that we are facing much, much, much worse. And I think that this is my personal opinion, that as a country, as a church, and as institutions, I believe that we have been stuck in denial, waiting for a return to life as usual. And that's unlikely to happen because the world has changed and we are not going to get a return back to normal. We are stuck. And if we remain in denial, we will remain stuck. Some common myths about grief and loss is that, okay, I can handle this on my own. I don't need to talk about it. Nobody, it's not affecting my work, my pain, anger, it'll go away. We also have this thing that bad things happen to other people. And if I don't deal with it now, nothing's going to happen. Nothing happened in the past, right? Nothing's going to happen. Myths. We need to support each other. When we have loss, we feel a need to connect. We feel a need to support. We feel a need to be supported. We feel a need to tell our story. And therefore, we need situations that will help us to really deal with this. So some general perspectives on the grief response. It's a universal occurrence. Every one of us is currently experiencing some level of grief or the other. We have losses that we know about, and there's stuff that we can't put into words exactly. Every one of us is currently experiencing this. Grief is a way that kind of pushes us to survive. And therefore, the question for all of us, how do we connect to come out of this together? Grief is generally adaptive, but it can also become maladaptive. So how do we alleviate maladaptive responses at individual levels, social levels, institutional levels? Grief is a natural phenomenon. It's a process. It involves pain, however. So how do we help each other to face this pain, engage in this process? There is no one right way to grieve. Each of us has our own way. Grief is not a sickness to be cured. We will carry our grief, some aspects of grief throughout our lives. There's no universal timetable that this happens and then we move on. Every loss that we experience is a multiple loss. Every old loss, every new loss will bring up echoes of old losses. And like I mentioned earlier, there is anticipatory grief. What's coming on the horizon? So what can we do to start the conversations around grief and loss? We need to name what we are going through. Name the feelings, name the meanings, and accept that this is okay. When we start sharing our pain, telling our stories, finding ways of connecting and supporting each other, then we start to heal as individuals, as families, as communities, as a country, as a world. And therefore, what can we do? How can we be present toward to the other person? How can we be present to what the person is saying, what the person is not saying, what the person cannot say without your help? Every grief that we experience in another is going to awaken the grief that I experience in myself. So in all of this, what am I feeling, thinking, experiencing? What losses of my own are being triggered off? What am I consciously or unconsciously avoiding? Now, in this process, we are going to come face to face with our own deepest fears and darkness and despair. We don't like pain, but unless we face our own pain, unless we face our own fears, unless we face this reality of, yes, I'm going to die, people I love are going to die, unless we face the pain, unless we grow into this process, we will not grow into deeper meaning. And hopefully, Our journey is to grow through trauma, beyond trauma, to grow through loss, beyond loss, into a deeper meaning. And with this, I stop the sharing and hand over back to Francis.
So thank you, Father Dinesh, for your presentation, insightful, and it puts us into a reflective and pensive mode about the reality that we face today. I am sure some of our participants, you would have some comments and some questions, which you can write in the chat box and we can take it up at the end of this webinar. Pain, suffering, death, trauma, and grief is not the last word. There is hope, there is a future to look forward to. Though every grief and pain is unique, it is an area which has been researched a lot. And who better to speak about this than Father Conrad, who has one of his areas of expertise is trauma focused on cognitive behavioral therapy. So it's over now to you, Father Conrad, to continue and give us some of your insights.
Thank you, Father Francis, and thank you, Father Dinesh, for your presentation. I will now share my screen. So good evening, everybody. And I focused my presentation on the stages of grief and COVID-19, as Father Dinesh has already highlighted in his presentation. You will see something below: the examiner, May 30th, June 12, 2020, Feast of the Pentecost. The dates are not wrong. When I began to research this presentation, I went back to some of my notes and I found that I had published an article in the Examiner, May 30th to June 12, 2020, and it was published on the Feast of the Pentecost, which is tomorrow. So that is also very interesting, and it gave me a sense of deja vu. Of course, I have upgraded the article for the presentation today. I'll be presenting based on relating the stages of grief to COVID-19. This article was written 1 year ago. The pandemic continues. And just as last year I wrote that there was a stage and a sort of recovery around this time, we still are in stages of recovery, rehabilitation, renewal. The vaccine has come in. There is a little bit more movement. There are no complete lockdowns like it was last year, although just now I saw that Tamil Nadu has gone into a sort of complete lockdown. There is a sense that a whole phase and stage of life has been lost. We have often heard comments like, where did 2020 disappear? Are we going to have a similar sort of comment past this year? Where has 2021 disappeared? But if you look at 2020 and 2021, the year disappeared, but people found meaning, moved on, and new ways of coping and new ways of doing things emerged. What has happened is that all of us have been forced to look at our lives because in some way or the other, we have had to make major or minor changes in lifestyle. And more importantly, we have had to face our mortality. When COVID struck us, most of us thought that if we die, we would die in the usual ways. When COVID-19 came upon us, it was something very unusual. We still do not understand the disease. And as much as we said last year that it's the older persons who are passing away, we now see this year there are a lot of young people too who are getting infected and passing away. So mortality is not something, as we grow older, mortality can come at any age. So in looking at COVID-19, if care is not taken, of course, people die. We learn to mourn what we have lost. We don't stop there. Recovery happens by finding meaning in what has happened. Even in a loss, even in grief. There are slight nuances to the understanding of grief and loss. Generally, grief is talked about someone who has died and passed away. Losses could be understood in other ways as well. Loss of a job, for instance. So Dr. Elizabeth Kubler-Ross, in her book Death and Dying, was the first to speak of 5 stages of grief: denial, anger, bargaining, depression, and acceptance. Initially, these stages were used to understand those who were dying of cancer and the caregivers who were looking after those who were dying of cancer. But now we realize that these stages can be used for all types of grief and loss. We need to remember, and this is a very strong caveat which we all need to understand, that these stages are not stops on a linear timeline. So it's not that denial and then anger and then bargaining and then depression and then acceptance and that meaning no. It is a spiral and we can keep going back and forth. And even if we have reached acceptance, there might still be a little bit of denial and a little bit of anger there. What these stages are tools to understand how a person is feeling as part of coping responses for someone to understand himself or herself, or for a helper to understand where the person is and how to help the person move towards meaning. David Kessler was a student of Elizabeth Kubler-Ross, and then in his conversations with his mentor, they thought that acceptance was not just the last stage, there should be something more. And so he added meaning, both of them, they wrote the book together, added meaning as the 6th stage in the stages of grief. So we've got denial, anger, bargaining, depression, acceptance, and meaning. So I would like to address recovery through these 6 stages. And I put the only red word in my slide presentation. When we look at how a person heals, how a person recovers, usually in psychology counseling, it's about how I do it. But in the present condition, and for anything, as Father Dinesh has presented, it's my recovery as well as community and society. We cannot deny the close connection between the two, because I am in society, and it's the I, thou, and the I, you relationship, which is very, very important if we have to address recovery, so it does not remain with the I. Whereas in the stages of recovery, it focused more on the I, even though caregivers were involved. So the first stage is denial. In this stage, whether it be the loss of a person, a job, not being able to attend a funeral, we know of many persons who have not been able to attend the funerals of close relatives or family members. Being isolated, many people have said going into that quarantine has been terrible. The world can become meaningless and overwhelming. What do I do with my time sitting in my house? For 10 months, I was inside this place. I did not go out. It can be overwhelming, especially for persons who are used to going out. So as the reality of the loss is accepted and denial realized, a person begins to ask questions about the what, the why, and the how of things. So when these questions begin to be asked, just as Father Dinesh also posed a lot of questions, when we begin to ask, why did daddy pass away, or why did mummy pass away? What was the reason? What could have been done? How could things have been done different? It is the beginning of a healing process. It's not that the person has been numbed with his fear, with his anxiety, with any other issues. It is the beginning of the healing process. And then we begin to move out of also ourselves. And this is important for the communitarian dimension and the dimension in society, when we also bring in the other, how the other is allowed into myself, and therefore we can use caregivers, we can use helpers, we can use support systems, and the world becomes a little bigger from me, where I'm not looking at things, to something which is larger. Anger is the second stage. I often say that anger is a healthy emotion, and I quote Aristotle there, in the right way to the right person in the right situation. But here this is a little different. This is a way to cope. especially in times of uncertainty. Daddy has gone, my child has gone, my work is gone, I'm working from home, I'm locked in my room. It's uncertain. The internet does not work, the internet works. A lot of uncertainty. It can be directed towards friends, the doctors, even self. Could I have done something more? Even a loved one who have died. Why did you leave me? How can I manage without you? And to God. Very often, underneath the anger is pain. It is raw. The person is raw, wants to heal. The pain a person has experienced. The person may get angry at someone who didn't attend a funeral, with someone who isn't around. Why didn't you come? I couldn't come. There was no way to come. Transport was closed. Or with someone who's acting out. Why are you behaving in this way? Can't you behave a little bit? I'm controlled. Why can't you get controlled? That person is behaving in the way which is his way or her way of behaving. It is often an indication of the intensity of loss. In trying to look at the situation in the country, look at society, sometimes we can have a righteous anger also, because I may be looking after myself, but the other may not be. And in the spread, very often these issues can happen. And where pandemics are concerned, and where endemics are concerned, sporadic outbreaks are concerned, localized outbreaks are concerned of any disease, this is something which needs to be considered, not as an individual, but also as a collective body. Dinesh talked about collective because the grief is not individual now, the grief is global. It's a collective grief, which is also not sporadic or localized or endemic. It is a global, it's a pandemic grief. Everyone is suffering the same way that we here in India are suffering. The third stage is bargaining. In this stage, there is a desire that life should return to what it was and the status quo should be restored. The companion to this stage is bargaining. If I had done this, this could have been better. If I had done that, that could have been better. Especially if there are unfulfilled wishes or jobs that were left incomplete, things left unsaid, emotions not expressed, and a sense, if only I had done. The preference is to remain in the past while trying to negotiate one ways out of the loss, pain, or grief into the present. So I'd like to remain there. But we have to go to the pain to move and to recover. So therefore, movement in self, and when we see movement occurring in society, in communities, that is a sign that yes, something is happening. The person is in the stages of movement towards acceptance and meaning making. Then comes the stage of depression or a constant low feeling. This is not clinical depression, as we will see later down in this slide. There is a feeling of emptiness. That person is no longer part of my life. I no longer have a job. As the loss and grief enter a deeper level, depression is something which is very low. It is important to understand that this depression or low feeling is the appropriate response to grief or loss and is not a sign of mental illness, as I said, clinical depression. So there is a fine line. Sometimes grief and loss can go into clinical depression. It requires specialists to know when that is happening. But having a low feeling when there is a loss or grief is something which should be considered as part of the normal movement towards recovery. What needs to be identified is what is causing the low feeling, and that worked with. Depression is one of the many necessary steps along the way to recovery. And in that, what could have been done to alleviate this low feeling? What could have been done for the others out to alleviate my low feeling, especially there is something which is low about the group outside, about the society, about the environment. Acceptance is the fifth stage. It is recognizing that the loss and grief is permanent. It's over. The person has gone, the job has gone. I have to downgrade my salary. It's permanent. It's not going to come back. 2020 is not going to come back. The early part of 2021 is not going to come back. We don't begin again. The person realizes that the past cannot be maintained as it has forever changed. And the person is called to adjust. What has been lost can never be replaced, but new connections, new meaningful relationships, and new interdependencies can be created. Persons can start to reach out and become involved in their own lives and the lives of others, especially if there is paralysis which has set in, don't want to do anything. And time can be invested in friendships and in self, especially when we stop taking care of ourselves because we are too much in the grief process. That is when the person begins to live fully again. And this is also true to make life worth living for others once we start finding meaning in our own lives. Before I go on to the sixth stage, there was something which I received today, which I thought I would show you all, which, since we are also learning about how to make movement in persons' lives, not just for ourselves, but also for community. It is a manual for healthcare professionals in providing psychosocial support to family members in bereavement in the time of COVID-19. So it's because we are persons who help. And this is something which has recently come out from the Indian Council of Medical Research. It also gives us guidelines of what we could do, just as I pointed out in the initial stages of grief, but these are some more points, just some bulleted pictures. Preparing family members for the risk, especially if somebody is sinking, oxygen levels are going on. How to break bad news. In facilitating the grief process, like I've already talked about, and practicing self-care for self. What caregivers forget is that very often there are losses which are greater for them when they're looking after somebody sick, and the stresses which a caregiver has is sometimes not understood while they are caring for someone who is sick. And even while caring for people outside who are sick in a large way, we take on the trauma of the person without understanding it. How do we reveal sensitively through empathetic listening in deciding and talking very carefully about when making a decision and ending a conversation very gently with persons who have passed away, especially when talking to family members. This is very difficult. It might look very easy, but it's very difficult actually. And this is a slide which I think we all need to consider, especially if we are caregivers. The self-care wheel, looking at the pillars which sustain us: physical, social, our professional, our spiritual, our psychological, and our emotional needs. If we are not getting them all, how can we get them in some ways? If I was a person who used to walk out in a garden and I can't do that any longer, can I walk around in my house? Or can I do sitting exercises if the house is not big enough? Or can I do yoga just in one place? Or even sitting in a place in my chair, can I just do stretching exercises, which would help me break away the stresses which are localizing in my body? So that's just for physical. The social dimensions, much more professional, spiritual, connecting with God, if especially if there are difficulties, my emotional needs, if they are not being met. This is something, again, in helping persons as they are moving towards recovery to look at, bringing back these things in a different way, because the person has gone through grief and loss, so therefore it would be different. And so the sixth stage of grief is meaning. This stage is more than just acceptance. It implies a full integration of the loss or grief into the person's spiritual, social, intellectual, emotional, physical aspect, so that the grief becomes a part. The grief is not the whole. It's a part of the person. It moves beyond acceptance. I've accepted the person's death, or I've accepted the loss of my job, but I'm now trying to find meaning. I don't just sit in my house. Maybe I can get a job which is low paying, but I'm getting a job which keeps me engaged. Meaning is about finding balance, coming into the presence. Dinesh talked about presence, 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 and finding light in times of darkness. There are streaks of light, and then the light becomes all encompassing. It involves being compassionate and patient with self. Human beings are not a math problem to be solved, which follows a process and then it is QED. That's the end. No, there are backs and forths. That's why I said the stages are stages which go back and forth. Even after we reach meaning, there can be a back and forth, but there is recovery if there is movement. So it involves being compassionate and patient with self, because returning to the new normal, this is a much bandied word, or life as usual never happens because lots has happened. Returning to the new normal is not something that might occur fast. Human beings are not maths problems. And then we take it out to others. We bring in this thing, once we have worked with ourselves, we take it out to others. So history tells us that this pandemic is survivable and that we will survive. What we need to realize is that we need to integrate our losses, that it might take time, and that it cannot be forced. And that is my last slide. Thank you.
Thank you, Father Conrad, for your presentation, for beautifully explaining the 6 stages through which we can process grief and trauma. Maybe we have some time for a brief dialogue on some fundamental questions. I shall just give me a moment to pin the 3. I'll Conrad?
Yeah, you can. Okay, I'm there, right?
You'll have to spotlight it, Francis.
Yeah, but
You can do multiple spotlights.
Oh, yeah, there you go. Okay. Fine. So a brief dialogue on some fundamental questions which emerge. The first refers to the long-term impact of the grief and trauma that is taking place. Right now, people are living real time. It's a rush for a bed in the hospital, a rush for getting some oxygen somewhere. If someone has died, somehow dealing with the funeral and so on. Before one is over, another begins. So right now, a lot of the grief and trauma is like real time. Can you say something, maybe Dinesh, Father Dinesh, you could begin the long-term impact on this, on the various sections of society, old, middle-aged, youth, children, and so on.
Yeah, we often talk about metal fatigue. Something is there and it's under constant stress. After a while, even something that is metal, very strong, breaks down. And I think something similar happens with us, because if we are under constant stress, loss, change, loss brings a lot of stress. It's going to affect, first of all, our physical health. It's going to affect the way we start relating to others. And if we don't deal with it, if we don't heal, it just becomes more and more baggage that we carry on. We say that time heals, and time in some way does bring some kind of lessening of the symptoms. However, talking about my own life, my brother died when I was 8 years old. I carried his death for 34 years. It is only when I went for tertianship, the tertian master said, "Oh, you're still carrying his death." I went to sadhana, he said, "Ah, you're carrying his death." But I had no way of dealing with it. But it had affected me. And it's only when I began to deal with it, it lifted. Okay, and that affected every aspect of my life. So it affects the physical, the emotional, I think also the spiritual. Yeah.
Okay. Father Conrad, anything on the long-term impact?
In talking about long-term impact, and here I'm talking about grief in particular, because about persons, not about losses like jobs. It is important to realize first how deep is the relationship that I have with that person. If it is a husband with a wife, if it is a mother and a child, if it is me and my daddy or me and my mummy, or is it I and somebody I know, a colleague, a relative, or maybe I'm just impacted by what is happening in the world. So one is, of course, the relationship. The second is how deep the intensity of the grief. So for instance, a person was healthy today. He came out of hospital. His oxygen levels were okay. Brought home and dies the next morning. We have heard of many cases like that. And then it suddenly happens. Persons think the person is recovering and it suddenly happens. The intensity of the time is there. A third point would be, how long was the person suffering? Was it a sudden thing or was it longer? In a longer period of time, there is more time for the person to get used to the idea that the person may pass away or die. Whereas if it happens suddenly, the person is at a loss. What Dinesh has focused on is really very important, not holding it in. Finding a person, a suitable person, even if it is somebody at home, to talk about that, to share the depth of the relationships, the closeness, and what the person is going through, and to seek for some way to alleviate the pain which the person is feeling inside. If it is not going away, then of course professional help is required. But sometimes just talking about it, even among ourselves and families, in communities, because the death of one person affects the entire family. The death of one person in a religious congregation affects every. Why did that happen? Especially if the person died young. So the long-term effects will depend on these 3 points which I mentioned. How long was the person suffering? How close was the relationship? And the intensity with which it happened. And again, to say what I had said earlier, human beings are not a math problem. Every person, whatever technique is used, will take that person's time to heal. It may be a back and a forth, but as long as there is some sort of movement which is seen, that is a positive sign.
Thank you, Father Conrad. A second point for a dialogue is the whole dimension of the community. Generally, it is seen that grief, trauma, suffering, death, and so on brings the community together. What's your analysis or observation about what is happening in this time of COVID in terms of the communitarian dimension, relationships, and so on? What is your analysis of the situation today in terms of the communitarian support systems and so on? Maybe Father Dinesh, you could probably begin.
Okay. I wouldn't say that a loss automatically brings people together. And I'll take the example of a family where a child dies. And the loss of a child is a tremendous loss for the parents. Now, what sometimes happens is that they have been so much part of this unit that every time they see each other, they are reminded of the loss. And that can be very painful, and sometimes that can lead to a greater and greater estrangement. It needs to be talked about, spoken about. The same thing, I think, can happen in communities. We have somebody who dies in the community. All of us carry some guilt about it, and we don't talk about it. We don't really bring our grief out into the open. It can drive a community apart. However, when we do start talking, when we do start sharing, when we do start reconnecting, because a loss, the person may die, but we have to find a way of reconnecting with the relationship. That is an ongoing process. So when that person once again becomes a living presence in the family or in the community, then that healing really happens. And then from that grows a deeper meaning and purpose.
Okay, Father Conrad.
I tend to agree with what Father Dinesh has said, in the sense that it could either bring people together or it could separate people. Why I say this is because of what I had stressed when I talked about uncertainty. If we look at what happened last year and we look at what's happening this year, last year there was much more uncertainty about what was happening because nobody knew what was the disease. And people were literally trying to cope in various ways. And because of uncertainty, there was a lot of fear which was generated. And thanks to WhatsApp University, many of these fears were just compounded, multiplied, and just as we talked about exponential numbers, the fears were exponentially exploding all over the place. So getting the right information and understanding what is right in healing processes is very, very important. Yes, once this happens and fears go, unfounded fears, it's not right to have a little bit of anxiety, but paralyzing fears and unfounded fears go away, then people come together because they understand that, yes, if I do this and if I take these precautions, I don't need to isolate and separate myself from people, but I can still interact and I can still have the social dimension in a slightly different way, as long as I put in the parameters of safety. So understanding those safety parameters is very important. And putting them and working at them is much more important than just understanding them.
And maybe just taking this question a little further, Father Conrad. Now, we know that there are many families where many in the family have been affected by COVID. Sometimes even tragically, some have passed away. Religious communities where a large number of people in the religious community have been affected by COVID. Father Dinesh also was speaking about in some way to go through a process. Now, supposing there is a community of say 10 people or 10 religious, and say 8 of them have been affected by COVID and have recovered or at various stages of recovery. How would that process be taken forward? Would they be in a position to talk among themselves, or do they need someone from out to probably facilitate a process? Father Conrad?
Um, when now I'm guessing that when you're talking about this, since you mentioned religious communities and we all live together, we are not persons who very easily talk about deeper things which affect us, especially our losses, because by and large we are known by our work and we don't want work to be compromised. And sometimes even when we are quite ill, we continue with our work. It is really important, maybe not with just necessarily let's say a trained facilitator, but it is important to talk about the losses we have experienced. I'll give you just one example, which I think everybody knows with regard to COVID-19. Anybody who has recovered from COVID-19, whether it is symptomatic or asymptomatic, suffers from, let's put it in simple language, tiredness. And this tiredness can be in various ways. My legs cramp up, my back, I feel tired, I want to go to sleep. And there could be other symptoms. Now, has that person ever talked about it? Or is he known by, oh, he's now not working as much as he should have worked before? Not realizing that maybe the tiredness is something, and we don't even know how long this tiredness will last because the disease is not understood. So maybe just talking about it, about what's happening to oneself, especially for someone who has experienced the disease, to someone who has not experienced the disease, even though he has the knowledge, would help in a greater understanding and a deeper understanding of what is happening there in the functionality of, let's say, the local situation. It might be different in different places, but that could be an important dynamic. And we need not have a trained facilitator, because I think there is enough of information which all of us have. I'm guessing that everybody here is a highly educated group and not all trained at WhatsApp University. So therefore, we all have the knowledge to be able to talk about ourselves.
Mm-hmm. So probably you are indicating towards, even if you don't have a trained person to facilitate a process, within a certain setup, if there is a certain degree of empathetic listening and ability to understand the other, that itself helps in a certain.
Yeah.
Okay. Father Dinesh, you want to add something on this?
No, I just agree completely with what Conrad has just shared. We don't like to talk about ourselves, and especially men don't like to show that they are weak. So we try and show that, okay, I can match up to, even if I am struggling. There are so many after effects of COVID that are affecting people, and some of them are life-threatening. Some of them are just reducing people's functionality. Not just at the physical level, but also at the emotional level and the thinking. So just I think talking about this needs to take place, listening to one another and finding that support for one another.
Okay. Yeah. Maybe there are a few more points for a dialogue, but then since we are short of time, maybe we can take a few questions which our participants have raised. So let me begin with the first one from Vijay, who says, everyone should get some scope for hope, mainly focus on that. But how is it possible? How is it possible in such a time to have hope? One of you would like, maybe Conrad, you want to just respond to that?
Well, hope is a very Christian virtue. We are known as a resurrection people. So that's why there is the dimension of hope and eschatology and things like that. But yes, when somebody is suffering and is going through the various stages of pain, hope can be given in that whatever best is being done at that present moment is being done. And at least we as doctors and psychologists, and also to quote what was in this recent document which came out from the Indian Council of Medical Research, which also says, never say things like you will get better when you don't know whether the person will get better or not, especially when we don't understand something. The best thing to say is that everything is being done that can be done. And another thing is when somebody has died, he has gone to a better place. Now, have I gone to that better place to tell the person that that person is going to a better place, and so they give the reassurance of hope that the place is better? No. So in talking to people, it's very important to know the nuances of the language. And the best thing in talking about where health issues are concerned is that what can be done is done and is being done. And that is where we look humanly towards what God has given us in the ability for us to be able to cope, as well as to look at the generosity which He offers us through the very many people, since we are a people who are connected to each other, who are helping us or helping the person who is affected or those affected to work towards their recovery.
Okay.
Here is death or without death.
Well, Dinesh, you want to say something about this dimension of hope?
I think we naturally grow towards life. Okay, you break a hand, what happens? Doctors put it into a plaster, but the healing process is there. And so therefore, to trust that this healing process is there. Part of engaging the pain, facing the pain, there a movement starts. And where there is movement, you get a sense of, yes, there is hope. Like Conrad was saying, we can have kind of a hope that is can be a problem, let me put it that way, because it gives a kind of false idea, oh yes, you're going to get well, everything is going to be okay, when the actual situation may not warrant that. And yet to know that, okay, our religious frameworks can give some direction towards that.
Yeah.
And even when I know that I'm going to die, there can be hope. And that is, I think, important, because that gives a framework of the horizons of my life go beyond the fact of my physical birth and death to a wider meaning.
This question is from Pushpa, who says she's making a reference to the stages that you spoke of for the Conrad. Can all these stages take place within a day or within a week? So is there some kind of a time frame? And that she adds to this question, these stages are in order, or is it possible that one can live only some of these stages?
Right. So I had mentioned this, that it is not linear. That is a back and a forth, and you can go from denial to acceptance straight. There is no such thing as, it has to follow. It was found that in persons who were dying, as well as in their caregivers, that these were the different stages. And it was later on seen through many, many, many people that it sort of followed an order, but it is not straight. And there is no time duration. Some people may remain in denial for a very long, very, very long time. And so there is no time duration. Also, I mentioned that human beings are not a math problem where it follows stage to stage to stage. So therefore, it is going to follow this way so that the person is going to recover. The person may still be at bargaining, or the person may still be at denial. So no, it does not follow a straight line. It can go back and forth, back and forth. And even when a person is at meaning, there may still be elements of denial over there. But what has happened is the person has moved and has become functional, has integrated the grief and the loss into the person's life, and has not got so stuck that the person is not functional.
Yeah. Thank you. Maybe Arun Kumar has this to say. Maybe Dinesh, you can respond to this. Quite a few parishioners are attending the seminar. Many of them are asking why God has allowed it. Anger is turned towards God. What would both of you say about the loss of the beloved or the person on whom the entire family relied upon? So, Dinesh, maybe you can start.
Anger is a natural response, and it doesn't matter whether it is directed towards God or the doctors or the person who's helping or you who are helping. It's natural. When I have lost something, underneath that loss is that pain that it needs to be expressed, right? Holding it in doesn't help. To all the parishioners who are going through this, I'd say God is big enough to take all your guns. God is big enough to handle it. So feel free on behalf of God and say, let yourself express whatever you feel comfortable expressing. Because that is the process of growing. Our God is a God, at least the God I believe in is a God of life. A God who, through, let's put it this way. Loss happens to us. Meaning is what we make of it. And the bigger the meaning that we can make out of it, the more we can grow. We can get stuck, like Andret said, in the anger. The problem is out there. The problem, okay, that's done. I lost my son in an accident. Yes, that's done. I can keep on going round and round that, or I can use this as a starting point to grow. And the first step in getting that starting point and growing is expressing the pain, getting the anger out, getting the hurt out.
Yeah. Conrad?
It is very difficult to answer a question like this, especially when God cannot respond. That is the only thing. But yes, we have a God who's loving. We have a God who's understanding. We do not have a God who brings on pandemics as we hear in the Old Testament, because a lot of what we hear in the Old Testament are lack of understanding, probably of hygiene, probably of disease, and probably of medicine. What we bring in our understanding is that there is a God whom we can go towards. The very fact that people are getting angry towards God is that, yes, there is somebody whom we can direct it. Dinesh rightly pointed out that God can take it. There is certainly difficult issues, especially if, say, for instance, someone who's supporting the family passes away. And then what happens to the family? I can sort of, I may not know what's happening wherever Arun is, but I can sort of feel that support systems come into place. Now, if support systems don't come into place, then we can wonder, why is God not acting? But support systems almost immediately come into place. I'll give you the example of my life, just as Dinesh shared. My mummy is 90, my niece is 13. My brother and his wife tested positive for COVID. My mom is almost bedridden. She has to be helped for everything. A support system came into place where in less than 3 hours after I got my RT-PCR negative in Pune, I could travel to Mumbai to look after them. Did I blame God for what happened to my brother and sister, or did I look at it? And I question that every day, including till the time I came back to Pune, where I had to do my test again. And I was extremely anxious that I should not test positive because I was handling mummy all the time. So the support systems came into place. My closeness to God increased because every day I was wondering. And I was also wondering at this God who made so many things happen, which brought so many resources closer. I'm sure that the persons who have got this anger towards God, which is okay, looking back and looking at the systems which have come into place to cope, which is a very secular word, or if you want to use the spiritual word of hope, to give hope, would give an indication of the action of God. I think we need to look at how God is also acting. The action of God is an indication of his presence in the world. That is also a direct question which I have over here from a Mr. Manohar. And that would also be the explanation which I would give you, Mr. Manohar.
Thank you. Thanks to both Dinesh and Father Conrad. Yeah, I think here also the faith dimension comes into play. And I think it was Moltmann, the famous German theologian, who lived through the horrors of the Second World War. When this question was asked at that time, where was God when all this was happening during the Second World War, the barbarities and the havoc? And the reflection is the God revealed in the incarnation is a God who journeys with us. He is present, He's journeying with us. He is present in the strength He gives people. He is present in the community support that comes in through various ways. But it's a God who is journeying with us. So I think that would be, a certain way of responding. He's not a magician God up there. No, He is journeying with us. He's journeying with us. There are many more questions, but since we are short of time, maybe we'll take just maybe one more, and then we can, maybe one or two we'll just take. There's a question about the vaccines. Maybe Father Conrad, since you are a doctor as well, can you say something about the effectiveness of the vaccine?
Now, that is a very difficult thing for me to answer. Let me just point this out about vaccines. We have all been inoculated when we were children. Polio, measles, mumps, rubella, MMR, all these vaccines. What a vaccine does is it creates a response in the body. Now, a vaccine is directed towards one virus: poliomyelitis virus, rubella virus, measles virus, mumps virus, tetanus. We've taken many shots of tetanus. So what a vaccine does is it creates an immune response in the body so that the person does not have the disease. He could contact the disease again with the same severity and the consequences, serious consequences that could occur. So did I get measles when I was young? Yes, I got measles. Did I get mumps? I got mumps, even though I was inoculated when I was a child. And I'm sure many of you all have had the same experience. So therefore, but it reduced the intensity and the severity of the symptomatology, which could create, because the antibodies were created in my body, which helped me respond better and therefore not have any of the serious consequences. That is the action of how a vaccine works.
Mm-hmm.
So with regard to the vaccines which we are talking about now, it is creating an immune response in the body so that persons who come in contact or even get infected would not have severity of symptoms. It does not mean that the person may not get it, may or may not get it. It depends on how strong the person's immunity is. Please note this. Otherwise, people say he took the virus, he took the vaccine and he got the disease. So depends again on how well we look after ourselves, because it doesn't mean taking the vaccine means we stop eating, stop exercising, keep on gorging on food, letting our immune responses go down, stop having a positive frame of mind. In fact, where COVID is required, these are things which are very important. So I think that's enough.
Okay. Yeah. Thank you, Father Conrad. But I guess some of the fears are whether all the vaccines have gone through all the stages of trials and so on. But most medical experts seem to suggest that even if you get infected, the severity of the disease generally would be, yeah. Maybe one last, since we are really short of time, maybe we'll take one last question of Benvin Lopez, who says, can you address the question of the over focus on religious practices, like just pray and pray, instead of seeking professional help to deal with grief and trauma? I think already Father Dinesh and Conrad have responded to that. I think, Benvin, that Of course, professional help is needed. At the same time, prayer and the spiritual dimension is one of those pillars of support. So I think a balance needs to be there without discounting the whole dimension of science and the psychological medical help which needs to be given. God works through all in a very special way these days through the caregivers, through researchers, doctors, nurses, and so on. So I think prayer also includes that, finding God in everything. It's a very Ignatian inspiration that to be able to see the God's presence, the God who is working in everything, in the caregivers, in the researchers, in the support systems, in families, unknown people coming out to help and so on. So I suppose a certain balance would be needed. Friends, there are many more questions, but I sincerely apologize since we are short of time and it had been announced 6 to 7. We are already 7:10. So it would have been wonderful to take all the questions, very good ones. You can always be in contact with the three of us. Surely Father Dinesh and Conrad are very competent to respond to many of your questions. Sorry to say we'll have to break here. We'll just end with a short prayer. I'll share a screen, and wherever you are, maybe you can just join in as we pray. It's a serenity prayer. I hope you are able to see it.
Yes.
Yeah. Just pause for a moment, and then wherever you are, please recite this prayer. God, grant me the serenity to accept the things I cannot change, courage to change the things I can, and wisdom to know the difference. Living one day at a time, enjoying one moment at a time, accepting hardships as a pathway to peace, taking as he did this sinful world as it is, not as I would have it, trusting that he will make all things right by surrender to his will, so that I may be reasonably happy in this life and supremely happy with him forever and ever. Amen.
In the next. Amen.
So let us continue to keep each other in our prayers and respond in whatever way we can, so that the pain and suffering of our sisters and brothers is alleviated and transformed into something positive and constructive. As we conclude, I would like to thank our panelists, Father Conrad and Father Dinesh. Thank you for your time, inputs, and insightful responses. It is like a drop in the ocean of great challenges, but each drop is worthwhile and meaningful. Thanks to each of you participants for your presence in this webinar. On behalf of the Nobili College, Papal Seminary, and Jnana Deepa, wishing you God's abundant blessings. Take care and remain safe. Thank you very much, and God bless. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you, fathers. Very nice.
Thank you, Father.
Thanks a lot.
Thank you, Father.
Thank you, Father.
Thank you, Father.